Hi everyone, welcome to this video on lesson 2 of the variation and inheritance scheme of work. So this lesson is on sexual reproduction, and it might look at first glance like this is almost identical to the previous lesson and to lots of what students studied back in year 7. I guess the difference in this lesson, and the point that you really want to emphasize to students, is that we're now going to relate today in this lesson, we're going to relate the process of sexual reproduction to this idea of variation. And this is the first time we're going to explicitly introduce this idea of variation, which, as the name of the scheme of work suggests, is a big idea that we're going to keep coming back to. And what I might do when teaching this lesson is to just contrast sexual reproduction firstly with asexual reproduction. So I might kind of divide my page into two with students and just give them some really simple examples of how single-celled organisms like an amoeba, something like that, something really basic that looks like this with a nucleus like that, when that reproduces, essentially all that happens is it divides itself, and I'm not going to go through the process of binary fission and all of that stuff, but it essentially divides itself into two identical copies. I'll try and make them as identical as possible. Two identical copies of itself. And what you want to emphasize to students is that when it divides like this asexually, the daughter cells here, the cells that have been reproduced, I should make that nucleus a bit bigger just so it looks kind of the same. These have the exact same characteristics as the parent cell. I'm going to stop talking so I can write that without any spelling mistakes. It's got the same characteristics as the parent cell. And if you wanted, you could label this as parent cell, daughter cells, whatever. But that's the first idea that you want to get across, is that one way of reproducing would just be to make copies, and that's a perfectly valid way of reproducing. But what you get is organisms with the same characteristics as you started with. Now we want to contrast that with sexual reproduction. Now the point here is, if you've got two organisms, and I'm going to draw these as people just to make it a bit more concrete, and I'll draw a kind of taller person to indicate a male, and a slightly shorter person to indicate a female. What happens when these two combine to reproduce a new organism? And this is similar to the diagram that I've left in the slides that Naomi drew. But what you're going to get is a new organism. And the point that you want to emphasize here, and again, you can add labels if you want to say, this is male gamete, sperm, female gamete, egg, 50% characteristics, and so on. But the really important point that you need to stress to students is that this organism that's produced by two organisms combining, this organism is going to have new characteristics. Now, when I say new, again, sorry, I'm going to have to stop and just write this. New characteristics. When I say new, that doesn't mean completely new. Many will be inherited from either parent. And again, this is a really good opportunity to speak to students. Ask them about the kind of things that they might inherit from their parents. I'm sure they will have stories to share about how, their brother's got brown hair and they've got blonde hair or whatever, all of that sort of thing. But the point that you want to emphasize is that with sexual reproduction, you don't just get copies of the parents, you get something different. And again, what we want to start to introduce here, and this is a big idea, this is not something students are going to grasp straight away necessarily, but what we want to start introducing in this lesson is that the fact that you get new characteristics leads to this big concept, which I'm going to label here as variation within the species, but I'm just going to call it variation here. Variation within the species. So you start to get organisms which look different to one another, because when two organisms combine, something else happens. A new organism is produced. It's not just a copy of the parent like in asexual reproduction. And again, we want to start introducing this idea that, well, why might that be useful, and why is it that over millions of years, this has turned out to be useful for species like human beings. And the idea that you want to get across is, well, okay, this amoeba is a perfectly good organism, but it can never kind of go beyond what it is already because it asexually reproduces. Whereas with a human being, and again, we're not winding the clock back yet, but we're going to wind the clock back because actually, as we want students to recognise, we didn't start out like this, and they may have this maybe a kind of religious conception of reproduction, but where we want to take them to, and this will take a while, we didn't start out like this, but it's because species are constantly changing and developing new characteristics and so on, that these new characteristics have begun to appear. These new organisms have begun to form. These new species have begun to become distinct. All of that comes back from the fact that when organisms reproduce sexually, there is this chance of getting new characteristics. So I'm not sure I've done the best job of explaining this, but hopefully what's clear from here is that the purpose of this lesson within the scheme of work is to link sexual reproduction with the possibility of variation. Variation is something we're going to keep coming back to throughout these lessons, so that ultimately we can get students to recognize themselves as the products of many, many, many generations of variation, right the way back from very, very simple organisms. But this lesson is where we first introduce that link, the fact that organisms that reproduce sexually develop new characteristics, and that's how you get variation within the species, which might be ultimately beneficial.